California's rural foothills in 1984 were not a place people expected bad things to happen. The roads were narrow and familiar, the towns small enough that strangers stood out, and most nights passed in quiet predictability. Life moved slower there, the kind of place where people believed danger belonged somewhere else. Cities on the news, names you heard but never imagined would touch your own address. The Bennett sisters lived just outside one of those towns, in a modest rental house surrounded by scrub trees and dry hills. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. Laura Bennett, 24, had taken on responsibility early. She worked steady hours, paid bills on time, and made sure her younger sister stayed grounded. She was cautious, practical, and often worried more than she let on. Emily, 21, was quieter. She noticed things others missed, tones of voice, shifts in mood, but rarely spoke first. Sarah, the youngest at 18, still carried the restless optimism of someone standing at the edge of adulthood. She wanted more freedom, more experiences, more proof that the world was larger than the hills she had grown up around. They were close, but not in a dramatic way. No constant hugs, no long speeches about love. Their bond showed in routine, shared meals, borrowed clothes, unfinished conversations that picked up days later without explanation. On the evening they disappeared, there was nothing unusual about their behavior. No arguments, no tension, no sense of finality. The plan was simple. A short road trip before nightfall, a drive that would take them past familiar stretches of highway and back before it got too late. Laura drove. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat. Sarah took the back, flipping through a cassette tape case, deciding what would play next. It was the kind of outing that barely registered as a memory while it was happening, but they never came back. By early morning, concern began to creep in. Laura was responsible. She didn't vanish without calling. Emily never missed check-ins. Sarah might be impulsive, but not careless enough to disappear entirely. When the hours passed without word, the unease hardened into fear. Local police were notified later that day. At first, the response was procedural. 3 adult women. No signs of distress reported. No history of conflict. In 1984, missing persons cases often followed a predictable script, especially when adults were involved. Officers asked the standard questions. Had they argued with anyone? Were there boyfriends? Financial problems? Drugs? The answers led nowhere. Then the car was found. It sat off a rural stretch of road, angled awkwardly near the shoulder, as if it had been pulled over briefly and forgotten. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside were personal items that didn't make sense to leave behind. Purses, a jacket, a cassette tape half ejected from the player. Nothing was visibly damaged. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just absence. To investigators, the scene felt wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. People don't abandon cars like that without a reason. 3 people don't leave together without taking essentials unless something interrupts them. Search teams were assembled quickly. Volunteers walked the surrounding terrain. Officers checked nearby properties, questioned residents, and scanned tree lines and ravines. Helicopters passed overhead, their noise cutting through the stillness of the hills. Dogs were brought in, but whatever trail existed faded quickly. There were no witnesses. No one recalled seeing 3 sisters stopped on the roadside. No reports of screams, no abandoned belongings beyond what was already in the car. The foothills swallowed sound easily, and that night had been quiet. As hours turned into days, theories began to form. Perhaps the car had broken down and they accepted help from the wrong person. Maybe it was an accident followed by panic. Some speculated that the sisters had chosen to leave, though no evidence supported it. Their bank accounts were untouched. No notes were left behind. Their lives were still mid-sentence. The Bennett family watched the investigation from the outside, clinging to updates that grew less frequent with each passing day. They replayed the last known moments endlessly. What song was playing, what time they left, whether there had been any hesitation at the door. Every detail felt suddenly important, even though none of it pointed to an answer. California in the mid-1980s was not immune to violence, even in places that felt safe. Organized crime rarely announced itself. Predators didn't look like monsters. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin, especially in rural counties where manpower was limited and cases piled up quickly. Still, no one wanted to say it out loud yet. The case remained officially open, but momentum slowed. Without evidence, investigators had little to push forward. The sisters' faces appeared briefly in newspapers, then faded as new stories replaced them. The foothills returned to their routines. Cars passed the spot where the Bennett vehicle had been found, unaware of its significance. For the family, time moved differently. Every phone call felt urgent. Every knock on the door brought a surge of hope, followed by disappointment. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived without explanation. The silence was its own kind of noise, filling every room. What no one knew then was that the truth of what happened that night did not end in those hills. It stretched far beyond them, buried under years of fear, survival, and silence. And somewhere, one of the Bennett sisters was still alive, carrying a story that would one day reopen everything investigators thought they understood. The search began with urgency, but not certainty. Within hours of the Bennett sisters being reported missing, local sheriffs, deputies cordoned off the stretch of road where the car had been found. The foothills, usually ignored by anyone without a reason to be there, became the focus of intense attention. Volunteers arrived from nearby towns, people who recognized the sisters' faces from flyers hastily printed and taped to storefront windows. They walked shoulder to shoulder through dry brush and uneven terrain, calling out names that echoed back unanswered. Helicopters swept low over the hills, their blades stirring dust and loose leaves, scanning ravines and tree lines for anything that didn't belong. Search dogs were brought in, trained to follow scent trails that could lead to clothing, bodies, or signs of struggle. But the ground was unforgiving. The soil was hard, winds were unpredictable, and whatever trace the sisters had left behind seemed to vanish almost immediately. The dogs circled, hesitated, then stopped. There was no clear direction to follow. Inside the abandoned car, investigators documented every detail. The cassette tape still sat halfway inside the player, as if someone had interrupted it mid-song. Purses rested on the floorboard. A jacket was draped over the back seat. These weren't items people left behind voluntarily. At least, not all three of them. The lack of damage suggested there hadn't been a visible struggle, but absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. In cases like this, silence often hid something violent. Days passed, then weeks. There were no ransom calls, no anonymous tips, no sightings reported that could be confirmed. The phone lines remained quiet in a way that felt deliberate, almost unnatural. In abduction cases, perpetrators often made mistakes early on. They contacted families. They bragged. They slipped. Here, there was nothing. As the investigation continued, internal disagreements began to surface. Some officers believed the sisters may have left on their own. 3 adults, after all. Perhaps they were running from something. Perhaps they wanted a new life. Others rejected that theory outright. Laura Bennett was known for responsibility. Emily was deeply tied to her routines. Sarah might have dreamed of more, but she would not have vanished without telling someone. And even if one of them had wanted to leave, all 3 disappearing together made little sense. Another theory suggested an accident. The foothills were dangerous at night. One wrong step, One unseen drop, and things could go terribly wrong. But searches of the surrounding area turned up nothing. No bodies, no damaged guardrails, no sign that a car had gone off-road. The terrain was unforgiving, but not invisible. The possibility of foul play lingered in every conversation, even when it wasn't spoken aloud. California, in the 1980s, was experiencing a rise in violent crime, including crimes committed far from major cities. Predators often operated where they were least expected. Rural roads, isolated stretches of highway, places where help was far away and witnesses were few. Still, without evidence, the theory remained just that, a possibility. Media attention arrived quickly, then just as quickly began to fade. For a brief moment, the Bennett sisters' story appeared on local news segments and in regional newspapers. Their photographs were shown, their names spoken. But without updates, the story lost momentum. Other cases replaced it. New tragedies took its place. Public attention moved on, even as the family remained frozen in time. For the Bennetts, the emotional toll was slow and relentless. At first, there was adrenaline, constant phone calls, meetings with investigators, hopeful interpretations of every rumor. Then came exhaustion. Nights without sleep. Days filled with waiting. The house that once held 3 distinct personalities became heavy with absence. Their rooms remained untouched, as if preserving them might somehow bring them back. Law enforcement continued to work the case, but progress stalled. The limitations of the era became impossible to ignore. There was no GPS data, no cell phone pings. DNA testing existed, but it was slow, expensive, and rarely definitive. Surveillance cameras were rare outside of banks and major intersections. Information sharing between counties was inconsistent, often slowed by paperwork and jurisdictional boundaries. Leads came in sporadically, usually vague and unhelpful. A waitress thought she saw someone who looked like one of the sisters, but couldn't be sure. A truck driver reported picking up hitchhikers weeks earlier, but descriptions didn't match. Each lead raised hope briefly, only to collapse under scrutiny. Investigators learned to approach every tip with caution, knowing how fragile families became when hope was repeatedly raised and crushed. As months turned into a year, the case shifted quietly. Active investigation became review. Review became storage. Files were boxed, labeled, and placed on shelves alongside dozens of others, cases that never found answers, only questions. Officially, the sisters were still missing. Unofficially, the case had stalled beyond recovery. The Bennett family felt the change immediately. Phone calls from detectives became less frequent. Updates grew shorter. The tone shifted from urgency to resignation. It wasn't neglect, it was reality. Without new evidence, there was nowhere left to go. The foothills returned to normal. Cars passed along the same stretch of road where the sisters' vehicle had once sat abandoned. New seasons changed the landscape. Rain erased footprints. Wind scattered anything that might have remained. Nature did what it always does. It moved on. Inside the family, grief took different forms. Some clung to the belief that the sisters were alive somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. Others began to prepare themselves for a different outcome, even without proof. The absence became permanent, a presence in every conversation and every silence. By the end of the second year, the case was officially classified as cold. It didn't mean it was closed. It meant it had nowhere left to go. The Bennett sisters became part of a growing list of names that law enforcement hoped, one day, might be revisited with new technology or fresh eyes. What no one could see then was that the silence surrounding the case wasn't empty. It was being held together by fear, memory, and survival. Somewhere beyond the foothills, beyond the files and the unanswered questions, one of the sisters was still alive, waiting for a moment when the truth would finally be safe to tell. By the mid-1990s, the Bennett sisters' case no longer lived on bulletin boards or in active briefings. It lived in cardboard boxes, stacked, labeled, forgotten by time, if not by memory. The paperwork told a clean story on the surface, dates, reports, search logs, but it failed to capture what 12 years of unanswered absence actually did to the people left behind. For law enforcement, the case became something officers encountered only when reorganizing storage or training new detectives. A missing persons file from 1984. 3 adult sisters. No confirmed sightings. No physical evidence recovered beyond an abandoned car. The kind of case instructors pointed to when explaining how investigations stalled before modern technology. No DNA databases. No cell phone records. No surveillance footage. Just paper, fading ink, and questions no one could answer. But for the Bennett family, those 12 years were not quiet. They were loud in a different way. Loud with routine pain. Loud with internal conflict. Loud with the constant mental replay of what might have happened during the hours no one could account for. The family fractured slowly, not because of blame, but because grief doesn't move at the same pace for everyone. Some relatives held tightly to the idea that the sisters were alive. That belief became survival. They followed every rumor, called police departments in other states, scanned crowds for familiar faces. Waiting became a full-time occupation. Others began to pull away from the case entirely. Not because they cared less, but because caring hurt too much. They needed to function, to sleep, to stop living inside 1984. Birthdays became unbearable. Laura would have been in her 30s now. Emily would have built a life of her own. Sarah would no longer be a teenager. Each passing year added weight to the absence, making it harder to imagine their return and harder still to accept they were gone. Psychologists often describe ambiguous loss as one of the most destabilizing forms of grief. There is no body to bury, no official end, just a question mark that never resolves. The Bennett family lived inside that uncertainty. Hope and despair coexisted, often within the same day. One moment, a phone ringing sparked adrenaline. The next, silence settled back in. For investigators, the silence was procedural. Cold cases rarely announce themselves when they're ready to be solved. They wait, sometimes for decades. Detectives who had once worked the case retired or transferred. New officers inherited the files without the emotional connection that came from standing at the roadside where the car was found or speaking directly to the family in those first frantic weeks. Occasionally, the case resurfaced. A new detective might review it, convinced that fresh eyes could find something missed. They read through witness statements, looking for inconsistencies. They re-examined maps. They traced timelines again. Each time, the same conclusion emerged. Without new information, there was nowhere to go. Meanwhile, the world moved forward. Technology advanced. Crime-solving methods evolved. DNA databases expanded. But the Bennett sisters' case remained stuck in the era it began. There was no physical evidence to test, no confirmed suspects to compare. Progress elsewhere only highlighted how little had been preserved back then. What no one fully understood during those years was the psychological weight carried by the sister who didn't come home, but was still alive. Sarah Bennett existed during those 12 years in a state of controlled invisibility. Survival, for her, was not a victory, it was a condition. She learned early that staying alive depended on staying quiet, on remembering details without ever speaking them aloud, on separating memory from emotion just enough to function. Survivor guilt does not announce itself immediately. It builds slowly, fed by questions that have no safe answers. Why me? Why not them? What if I had acted differently? What if I had fought harder? Sarah carried those questions silently, convinced that survival itself was something she would one day have to justify. Fear shaped every decision she made. Not fear of the past, but fear of being found again. She understood, instinctively, that the people who had taken them did not exist as a single moment in time. They were still out there, still capable, still dangerous. Silence felt safer than truth. From the outside, the world saw three sisters who vanished. Inside that truth was another reality, one that remained hidden because revealing it felt more dangerous than living with it. Trauma narrowed Sarah's world to what was immediately survivable. Long-term justice was a luxury she could not afford yet. Law enforcement, unaware of this hidden survivor, continued to treat the case as a disappearance frozen in time. Theories remained unresolved. Voluntary disappearance faded as the years passed. Accidental death seemed increasingly unlikely. Foul play became the unspoken assumption, but without proof, it remained only that. The family learned to live with unanswered questions, even as those questions shaped every aspect of their lives. Some stopped speaking about the sisters altogether. Others spoke of them constantly, keeping their presence alive through memory, alone. Both approaches were attempts at control over something fundamentally uncontrollable. By the mid-1990s, the case had reached a psychological endpoint for most people involved. Not closure, just exhaustion. The expectation of answers had eroded into something quieter, a hope so faint it barely registered, but never fully disappeared. Then, one night, 12 years after three sisters left for a short drive and never returned, a hospital intake form in California included a name no one expected to see again. A name that hadn't been spoken in official reports for over a decade. A name that would pull a cold case back into the present and force everyone involved to confront a truth far darker than anything they had imagined. Sarah Bennett had come back. In the spring of 1996, a California emergency room processed another anonymous intake. The patient was malnourished, dehydrated, and visibly disoriented. She carried no identification. Her clothing was worn down to the seams, not dirty in a way that suggested homelessness, but degraded in a way that hinted at long-term neglect. Nurses noted bruising in different stages of healing, old injuries layered beneath newer ones. Her hands shook uncontrollably, even when she was lying still. At first, no one connected her to a 12-year-old missing persons case. She gave her name quietly, as if testing whether it was safe to say it out loud. Sarah Bennett. The name triggered a pause. Then another. A staff member excused themselves and made a call that set off a chain reaction few people in that hospital could have imagined. Within hours, fingerprints were taken. DNA samples were collected and rushed through comparison. When the confirmation came back, it felt unreal even to the professionals reading the report. The missing sister, the youngest one, alive. News traveled quickly but carefully. Law enforcement was notified before the family. Investigators who had never worked the case were suddenly holding files older than their careers. Retired officers were contacted. Supervisors reopened sealed boxes. A case long considered dormant was abruptly breathing again. When Sarah was told that her identity had been confirmed, she didn't react the way people expected. There were no tears of relief, no visible sense of victory. Instead, there was fear, immediate and consuming. Her first concern was not herself. It was whether anyone else knew she was there. Doctors and trauma specialists recognized the signs instantly. This was not someone who had simply survived an accident or lived off the grid. This was someone who had learned that visibility could be dangerous. Over the following days, Sarah's physical condition stabilized enough for investigators to request a statement. They didn't rush her, at least not at first. Trauma interviews are built on patience, and whatever had kept her silent for 12 years was not going to dissolve in a single conversation. When she finally began to speak, the story came out slowly, fragmented, often interrupted by long pauses where she seemed to retreat inward, replaying memories she had worked hard to keep buried. She told them about the night in 1984, about the roadside stop that never felt right, about how help arrived too quickly, about men who seemed organized, calm, and practiced. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was planned. The sisters were taken to a secluded location far from the foothills, a place chosen specifically because no one would hear them, see them, or come looking. Sarah struggled to explain the passage of time there. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Control was constant, movement was restricted. Fear became routine. She spoke of systematic violence without detail, her words clinical, detached, as if describing something that had happened to someone else. Trauma specialists would later explain that detachment was not avoidance. It was survival. Naming everything explicitly would have made it impossible to continue living through it. What mattered most to investigators was what followed. Sarah described how the group operated, how many men there were, the roles they played, who spoke, who watched, who enforced rules. She remembered vehicles, patterns, small details that had embedded themselves in her memory because noticing them was the only control she had left. And then she explained how she escaped. The opportunity was rare and unplanned, a moment created by complacency, a door left unsecured, a routine disrupted just enough to break the system that had held her. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know how far she ran, only that stopping meant dying. When she reached safety, the instinct to disappear overpowered everything else. She didn't contact police. She didn't reach out to family. She vanished again by choice this time, convinced that any attempt to return to her old life would put her, and anyone she contacted, at risk. The hardest part of her statement came last. Laura and Emily never escaped. Sarah did not witness their deaths. She did not know exactly when they were taken away, only that one day they were gone. Their absence was explained in ways that made questions dangerous. Over time, Sarah understood the truth without ever hearing it spoken. That knowledge shaped every year that followed. For investigators, the revelation was devastating and clarifying at the same time. The case had never been a disappearance. It had been a prolonged captivity, followed by calculated silence. Everything that once seemed inexplicable, the abandoned car, the lack of witnesses, the absence of ransom, now fit into a pattern that made terrible sense. For the Bennett family, the emotional impact was almost impossible to process. Joy and grief collided without warning. One daughter returned from the dead. Two were confirmed, lost forever. There was no script for how to hold both truths at once. Sarah was reunited with her family under strict protection. Her physical presence brought relief, but her emotional distance was unmistakable. She carried guilt that no reassurance could erase. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for leaving. Guilt for speaking now instead of sooner, even though rationally she knew silence had kept her alive. Law enforcement moved quickly once her statement was complete. This time, there were details, names, descriptions, a framework for investigation that had never existed before. Detectives began cross-referencing Sarah's information with unsolved crimes from the 1980s. Patterns emerged, similar disappearances, similar locations, similar methods. What had once been an isolated mystery was now clearly part of something larger. And as officers followed those connections deeper into the past, it became clear that Sarah's return was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an investigation that would finally expose what happened to the Bennett sisters and uncover a truth even more disturbing than anyone had prepared for. Once Sarah's statement was formally recorded, the case changed shape almost overnight. For the first time in more than a decade, investigators were no longer working backward from absence. They were working forward from lived experience. Every detail Sarah had carried in silence suddenly mattered. Not just what happened, but how it happened. Where? When? By whom? Detectives began by isolating the elements of her memory that could be independently verified. She spoke about vehicles first. Not license plates, those had been hidden, but colors, body types, interior damage, the way one door always closed harder than the others. She remembered accents next, not exact words, but rhythms of speech. One voice that commanded, another that rarely spoke, one that sounded local, another that didn't. These details were small, but consistency made them powerful. She described routines, times of day when movement was allowed, moments when supervision slipped, patterns that had kept her alive because recognizing them meant avoiding punishment. Trauma specialists sat in on every interview, not to soften the investigation, but to preserve it. Pushing too hard, too fast, could fracture memory. Patience, they knew, would yield more truth than pressure ever could. Cold case detectives were brought in, officers trained to work without momentum, without witnesses, without fresh evidence. They reopened boxes sealed years earlier and laid everything out across conference tables. Old photographs, search maps, witness statements dismissed in the 1980s as unreliable. With Sarah's account in hand, those fragments began to rearrange themselves. One report mentioned a suspicious van seen near a rural road weeks before the sisters disappeared. At the time, it led nowhere. Now, its description aligned closely with what Sarah remembered. Another tip referenced a group of men frequenting a remote property outside county lines. The location had been searched briefly in the 1980s, but without probable cause, investigators had moved on. Now, that address returned to the center of the map. Technology filled in gaps time had created. Advances in forensic databases allowed detectives to link crimes across jurisdictions that once operated in isolation. Assaults reported in neighboring counties during the same period shared similarities, methods, locations, victim profiles. Alone, each case had seemed unconnected. Together, they formed a pattern. The pattern pointed to 5 men. They were not strangers to law enforcement. Some had prior arrests. Others had managed to stay just outside serious scrutiny. In the 1980s, they had moved frequently, changing locations and routines just often enough to avoid attention. Their crimes were controlled, deliberate, and designed to leave as little evidence as possible. Surveillance began quietly. There were no dramatic raids, no public announcements. Detectives observed. They verified addresses. They cross-checked employment records and vehicle histories. When one name surfaced repeatedly across unrelated reports, investigators knew they were close. Arrests came one by one, spaced deliberately to avoid alerting the others. Each was handled according to procedure. Warrants served, rights read, evidence cataloged. There was no resistance, no confessions at first. Men like these relied on silence, believing time had erased their trail. Sarah was kept informed, but at a distance. Her cooperation had been essential, but her safety remained the priority. Every arrest triggered a new wave of fear. Trauma does not end when danger is removed. For Sarah, the threat felt permanent. Faces from her past were now real again, no longer locked in memory. Nightmares intensified. Sleep became unpredictable. Guilt surfaced in ways she hadn't expected. She questioned every decision she had made, every moment she had stayed silent. Even as professionals reminded her that survival was not a crime, responsibility weighed heavily on her. If she had spoken earlier, would her sister's fate have changed? It was a question with no answer, but it lived inside her anyway. Investigators continued building their case carefully. Interrogations focused on inconsistencies. Alibis collapsed under scrutiny. Small contradictions accumulated, tightening pressure without force. Eventually, one of the men broke. Not out of remorse, but self-preservation. He offered information in exchange for leniency he would never fully receive. What he revealed confirmed what detectives already feared and deepened what Sarah already knew. The gang had operated beyond just the Bennett sisters. They had targeted vulnerable moments, isolated roads, situations where intervention was unlikely. The sisters had not been random. They had been noticed, followed, selected. For Sarah, this confirmation was devastating. It stripped away the last illusion that what happened to them had been singular or accidental. It was systematic, rehearsed, and it had worked because no one had been looking for it. As charges were prepared, prosecutors worked closely with investigators to ensure the case would withstand scrutiny. Decades-old crimes required meticulous documentation. Every claim had to be supported, every memory corroborated where possible. Sarah's testimony would be central, but it would not stand alone. The emotional weight of this phase pressed heavily on everyone involved. For detectives, it was the rare opportunity to resolve a case long thought unsolvable. For the family, it was a slow realization that answers were finally coming. Answers they had waited 12 years to hear and feared hearing at the same time. For Sarah, it was something else entirely. Truth had kept her alive. Now, it demanded everything from her. As investigators prepared to move beyond arrests and into the final phase of the case, one question remained unanswered. The most painful one. The one no one had yet spoken aloud. The question of where Laura and Emily had been taken, and what exactly had happened to them after Sarah escaped. The answer to that question was waiting, and it would change everything. The arrests changed the pace of everything. What had moved slowly for years now accelerated with purpose. Warrants were signed, properties were secured, and teams were sent to locations that had once existed only in fragments of memory and half-forgotten reports. These were not dramatic places. No obvious signs of horror. Just remote structures scattered across rural California. Cabins, storage sheds, abandoned farm buildings. Places chosen precisely because they blended into the background. Investigators approached each site with caution, not because they expected resistance, but because time had a way of preserving things people believed were long gone. Floors were measured, walls were tested. Soil was disturbed carefully, inch by inch. Every object was cataloged, every trace treated as if it mattered, because now it did. At one location, buried beneath years of neglect, they found what they had hoped not to find. It wasn't obvious at first. The land had been altered, deliberately but crudely. Digging began slowly, methodically. When the first indicators emerged, the work stopped being procedural and became something heavier. Forensic teams took over. Silence settled across the site in a way no one needed explained. The evidence confirmed what Sarah had carried with her for 12 years. Laura and Emily had not survived. There were no dramatic revelations, no single moment that explained everything. Just facts, assembled carefully, spoken quietly, dates approximated, circumstances reconstructed. The kind of truth that doesn't arrive with shock alone, but with a deep, sinking finality. The sisters who had vanished in 1984 were no longer missing. They were gone. Sarah was informed privately, surrounded by professionals trained to deliver devastating news. She did not cry immediately. Her reaction was stillness, a long pause, where grief, confirmation, and guilt collided all at once. She had lived with the assumption for years, but assumption and proof are not the same. Proof changes the shape of grief. It makes it permanent. She asked questions that had no comforting answers, about timing, about whether they suffered, about whether there had been any chance. Investigators answered what they could and refused what they couldn't. Some details were withheld, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. Not everything needed to be said aloud to be understood. For the Bennett family, the discovery was both an ending and a beginning. After 12 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers. But answers came at a cost. Hope, which had once been painful but sustaining, was replaced by a different kind of pain, one that no longer shifted or changed shape. It settled. Funeral services were held quietly. There was no spectacle, no media presence invited, just family, memory, and the difficult task of saying goodbye to two lives that had been paused, not ended, in their minds for over a decade. The legal process moved forward with grim determination. Prosecutors presented evidence built carefully over months of investigation. Sarah's testimony was central, but it was not alone. Physical findings, corroborated timelines, and confessions formed a case that left little room for doubt. Each man faced charges tied not only to the Bennett sisters, but to a broader pattern of crimes committed during the same period. Convictions followed. Sentences were long. Some would never leave prison. There were no statements that offered closure, no apologies that meant anything. Justice, in this case, was procedural. It did not heal. It did not undo. It simply acknowledged responsibility and removed the threat from the world. Sarah attended parts of the trial, but not all of it. She learned quickly where her limits were. Survival had taught her to listen to her instincts, and this was no different. When proceedings ended, she did not feel relief. She felt tired. Closure is a word often used in stories like this, but it rarely applies cleanly. Sarah had answers now. She had confirmation. She had justice in the legal sense. What she didn't have was peace. Trauma does not dissolve when truth arrives. It changes form. It becomes something that must be carried consciously instead of avoided. In the months that followed, Sarah began rebuilding her life in ways that were quiet and deliberate. Therapy was slow. Progress uneven. Some days felt almost normal. Others pulled her back into the past without warning. She learned that healing was not a straight path. It was a series of returns. Returns to memory, to fear, to grief, followed by small steps forward. The Bennett sisters' story did not end with headlines or dramatic conclusions. It ended with reality, with accountability, with the acknowledgement that what happened to them mattered, even if it took 12 years to say so out loud. Laura and Emily were remembered not for how they died, but for who they were before they disappeared. Sarah carried them with her, not as unanswered questions, but as part of her truth. The road they had driven in 1984 still existed. Cars still passed over it every day. Most people never noticed it. But for those who knew the story, it marked a moment when ordinary life fractured without warning, and a reminder that sometimes the most shocking discoveries are not sudden twists, but the quiet confirmation of what silence has been hiding all along.